Case File 001, Species, Human. Initial Assessment, Reckless Primitive Endangering the Perimeter. Final Assessment, Withheld. The archive keeps a saying, older than most of the species inside it. A blade does not stop being sharp when it breaks. It only stops being useful to the ones who forgot how to hold it. This is a record of a misjudgment, not a small one, made by one frightened soldier in the dark, but a large one, engineered into doctrine, taught in academies, stamped into the reflexes of a fighting people so thoroughly that it had stopped feeling like a choice at all. They looked at a suffering thing and saw only a cost to be closed out. They looked at a small creature walking toward that suffering and saw only a fool. They were wrong on both counts, and they learned it in the space of a single hour, in a scorched corridor that still smelled of the battle. This is the story of the day the galaxy learned what it had thrown away. The fighting had ended 4 hours earlier, and the corridor still had not learned how to be quiet. It was less a corridor than a wound cut through the rock, a wide processing artery the assault had punched open, its ceiling gone, the sky above it the color of old bruises. Emergency beacons pulsed a slow red along the walls, and where the red failed, portable surgical lamps stood on tripods and threw hard white circles onto the ground. In those circles, work was happening. Outside them, shapes moved in the dark and did not speak. Corporal Elias Marsh knelt inside one of the white circles with his hands inside a man who was going to live. He could tell the man would live by the way the bleeding had changed under the gauze, no longer the bright, insistent push of an artery, but the slower, sullen seep of something clotting. Marsh packed the wound anyway, deliberate, both thumbs steady, and he did the thing he always did without deciding to do it. He slowed his breathing. In through the nose for a 4 count, hold, out for a longer one. He had learned it in a classroom a very long way from here, and he had used it in worse places than this. And by now it ran on its own, the way a heartbeat ran, the way fear ran. The trick was never to have no fear. The trick was to breathe under it until your hands forgot to shake. The man beneath him was not human. Most of them here were not. Marsh's small trauma team had been folded into a larger Allied push, and for 6 days they had worked shoulder to shoulder with the tall, angular soldiers of a people whose name Marsh's mouth could not quite make. They were exoskeletal, dark-plated, their faces almost still, built for coordination, not expression. He had learned to read them anyway, the way he read everyone, off the hands and the set of the shoulders, and the small betrayals, no training ever fully erased. The one he'd just finished with had a betrayal like that now, a faint tremor in the long fingers, the aftermath of pain and fear finally allowed to arrive. Marsh pressed the last dressing flat and left one hand resting on the plated shoulder a beat longer than the wound required. He didn't say anything clever. He said low, "You're all right, you're all right. That's the worst of it done." The soldier probably understood none of the words. That had never once mattered. Presence carried across every border a language ever drew. Nearby, a young alien trooper was watching him. Marsh caught it in the edge of his vision, the way the trooper's head had tilted, the way the exhaustion in the corridor made everyone slightly too honest. The whole force was strung tight, wired on the aftershock of combat, movements jerky, voices clipped and high. And here was this soft-skinned human breathing slowly, deliberately, like a man with all the time in the world, his shoulders dropping instead of climbing. The trooper seemed unable to look away from it, as if the calm were a thing he had never been issued and did not know was available. Marsh gathered his kit, capped what needed capping, and let his gaze move down the length of the ruined corridor, doing the count he always did. Who was up, who was down, what came next. Then, at the far end of the corridor, something they had all mistaken for wreckage lifted its head. It rose out of the dark past the last surgical lamp, and the size of it rearranged the corridor. Marsh had walked past it 3 times in the last hour and taken it for a collapsed section of armored transport, a great heaped mass of plating and shadow half buried in rubble. Now the mass moved, and a head came up on a neck as thick as a man was tall, and 2 eyes the deep orange of banked coals opened and found the lights and hated them. It was a war beast. Marsh had heard the Allied soldiers speak of them in the clipped way people speak of weapons they are grateful for and slightly ashamed of. Bio-augmented, grown and built in equal measure, a living siege engine plated in the same dark armor as its handlers. This one had been magnificent. Now one of its forelimbs lay wrong beneath it, and a long section of its flank had been opened by something that punched through armor, and the ground beneath it was black and wet in the red light. It dragged in a breath that Marsh felt in his own sternum, a low grinding groan that vibrated through the rock and up through his knees. Around its neck sat a heavy segmented ring, thick as a mooring collar, its surface warped and slagged where some catastrophic surge had melted it half through. Even ruined, Marsh could see what it had been for. It was a leash. It was a switch. It was the kind of thing you put on a creature when you had decided in advance that you might one day need to end it from a safe distance. The beast turned its head, and its coal eyes swept the corridor, and every alien soldier in range went absolutely still. Sub-Commander Kettlevar did not go still because he was afraid. He went still because stillness was correct. He stood at the perimeter with his status runes glowing steady on his chest, and he watched the damaged asset lift its head, and he felt the situation click cleanly into a category he had trained his entire life to recognize. There was no distress in him. Distress, around a thing like this, was a failure of rank. The measure of an officer was how flat he could hold himself while doing the necessary thing, and Kettlevar held himself very flat indeed as he raised his hand, and the runes along the perimeter answered him, shifting one by one from the amber of active combat to a colder, more specific orange. He looked at the melted collar and understood at a glance what it meant. The remote shutdown was gone. The clean solution, a single command, a quiet collapse, the asset switched off where it lay, was no longer available to him. The device that existed precisely so that no soldier would ever have to stand within reach of a dying warbeast had itself died first. Doctrine had a gap in it now, a small, ugly gap shaped exactly like this moment, and Kettlevar felt the wrongness of it the way one feels a missing tooth with the tongue. No matter. Doctrine had a second answer for when the first answer failed. He spoke, and his voice carried the flat cadence his people prized, each word placed like a stone. The asset was combat ineffective. The asset presented active risk to friendly forces. Retrieval was not authorized. Field treatment was not authorized. He watched the words land on the soldiers around him and settle them, because that was what doctrine was for. It took a horror and made it a procedure, and a procedure could be carried out by anyone, by hands that did not have to feel. The order had a name in their language, and the name meant, put it down. They sent a drone first, because that was also doctrine. You spent metal before you spent soldiers. It was a squat medical retrieval unit, unarmed, and it drifted toward the beast on its repulsors with a soft servo whine, running some placid subroutine that did not know it was about to die. Kettlevar watched it go with no expectation of success. This was the confirmation step. The manual required a demonstrated current threat before neutralization, and the drone would provide it. The beast let the drone come within 4 body lengths. Then it moved. For something so ruined, it was obscenely fast, a lash of the intact forelimb that Marsh's eye could barely follow, and the drone was simply gone, not disabled, not damaged, but converted in an instant into a spray of components that rang off the corridor walls. The concussion of it reached the perimeter a half-second later. A young handler near the front, someone who had walked that same beast to the line only days ago, made a sound, a small broken sound, cut off almost before it started, and put out one hand toward the wreck as if there were anything to be done. The soldier beside him looked away, not in fear, in something more trained than fear, a practiced aversion, the way you avert your eyes from a thing that is not permitted to matter. To grieve an asset was to admit an asset could be grieved, and that admission was itself a kind of damage. Marsh, watching from his circle of white light, saw the flinch and saw the looking away, and understood he was seeing a rule enforced without a word being spoken. Kettlevar's runes flared. The threat was current. The threat was demonstrated. He gave the second order, and at the corridor's mouth a neutralization cannon woke with a rising electronic hum, and a calm synthetic voice began, without urgency, to count. And then, while every soldier held still, one of the humans started walking toward the beast. Later, no one in that corridor could agree on the exact moment they understood what the human intended. Marsh himself would not have been able to tell them. There had been no decision he could point to, no instant where he weighed the thing and chose. There had only been the young handler's cut-off cry, and the melted collar catching the red light, and the calm synthetic voice starting its count. and then his own feet already carrying him forward, his kit already in his hand, his breath already dropping into the 4 count without his permission. An armored hand closed on his arm. It was Kettle Var. Marsh had not seen him cross the distance. Up close, the officer was a head and a half taller, all dark angled plate, and the runes on his chest threw that cold orange up under Marsh's chin. The alien spoke, and a translator patch on Marsh's collar turned it into flat-clipped fragments. Asset, neutralization, authorized, withdraw. The meaning assembled itself a beat behind the sounds, the way it always did, and the meaning was, that thing is already dead, and I will not lose a soldier confirming it. Marsh looked up at him. He did not pull against the grip. Pulling was a threat, and he had spent a career learning not to be one. He kept his voice exactly where he'd kept it over the wounded soldier a few minutes before, low and even and unhurried. He's still breathing, Marsh said. If he's breathing, he's mine to look at. The words went into the patch and came back out in the alien's language, and Marsh watched them fail. Not because the translation was poor, because there was no slot in the officer to receive them, mine to look at. An asset was no one's to look at. An asset was inventory. An inventory that had gone dangerous was inventory you deleted. The concept behind Marsh's sentence had no shelf in Kettle Var's mind to sit on, and Marsh saw it fall straight through and land nowhere. The grip did not loosen, but it did not tighten either, and in that half-second of nothing, Marsh gently rotated his arm free, the way you free yourself from a frightened patient. No yank, just a slow, steady turn, until the hand had to either crush or let go, and it let go. 90 seconds of countdown, Marsh said. That's your rule, not mine, so you've got 90 seconds to decide you'd rather not shoot a medic in the back. He was already turning. I'd decide fast. Behind him, the corridor had gone the particular silence of a great many people watching one small thing. He felt every eye of it on his spine. The young trooper who had watched him breathe was somewhere back there, and the handler who had cried out, and the flat officer working through a calculation that had no clean answer left in it. He crossed the last painted line, and behind him, he heard the officer say a single word he didn't understand, but he understood exactly what it meant. The ground changed under his boots when he passed the line. Beyond the perimeter, the corridor floor was a ruin of impact craters and scorched rock, the record of every previous attempt to approach written in blackened stone. Grit crunched, then gave way to something viscous that dragged at his soles. The beast's blood, spread wide and cooling. The air changed too. It got heavier, thick with ozone and copper, and a deep, musky electrical smell he had no name for. The smell of an augmented body that had been built past what a body should be, and was now failing all at once. Marsh did not walk straight at it. He had never in his life walked straight at anything wounded and afraid. He came in at an angle, off the line of the head, slow, his hands loose and visible and low, letting the great orange eyes track him without being challenged by him. He did not stare into them. He let his own gaze rest a little to the side, on the ruined flank, on the wrong bent forelimb, on the work that needed doing, and he talked while he came. He didn't say anything that mattered. That wasn't the point. The point was the sound, a low, rhythmic, going-nowhere murmur, the voice a man uses on a spooked horse in a dark barn, on a child after a nightmare, on a soldier holding his own insides in. There you are, big man. I see you. I'm not gonna rush you. We've got time, you and me, all the time in the world. The beast watched him come, its breath sawed in and out, that chest-deep, grinding groan, and Marsh matched his own breathing to the gaps between, slowing, making his whole body into a thing that was not in a hurry and was not a threat. 40 feet. 30. The synthetic countdown murmured somewhere behind him, indifferent. 20 feet, and he could feel the heat coming off the animal now, could see the fine tremor running through the plated shoulder, the tremor of an engine redlining on its last fuel. At 15 feet, the beast decided it had allowed enough. The intact forelimb came up and around in a strike that erased the distance, a black scythe of armor and claw, and there was no time to run, and Marsh's training did not tell him to run. It told him what it had told him in the classroom a lifetime ago. Sudden movement is a threat. A threat is an invitation. So he did the hardest thing a body can be trained to do, which is nothing. He held, and let the blow decide. The claw came down close enough to stir his hair, and instead of running, Marsh lowered himself to the ground. He sat. Not fell, sat, folding down cross-legged onto the bloodied rock the way a man sits at his own hearth, deliberate and unhurried, taking his own height away, taking the last of the threat out of his outline. It was the most unnatural act his nervous system had ever been asked to perform. Every animal instinct he owned was screaming at him to be big, to be gone, to be anywhere but folded small and soft within reach of a thing that had just unmade a drone. He sat anyway, and he kept the murmur going, low and steady, and he set his kit down beside him with slow, open hands. The forelimb hung over him, raised, quivering. The beast's head swung down on that tree trunk neck until one coal eye was level with him, close enough that its breath moved his hair and clothes with every heave, hot and wet and stinking of blood. This close he could see the pain in it, the enormous animal bewilderment of a thing that had only ever been pointed at enemies and now hurt everywhere, and could not understand why the small, soft creature would not run so it could stop having to fight. "I know," Marsh said to it, very quietly. "I know it hurts. I'm not going anywhere." He did not reach for it. He reached, slowly, for his own kit, and unrolled it flat on the rock where the eye could see every tool, hiding nothing. And he began, without touching the animal at all, simply to look, to do the assessment, the old reliable litany, reading the flank and the breath and the color of the blood, letting the beast watch a creature do steady, unhurried work beside it for the first time in its whole manufactured life. The beast's breath stopped for one long second, and then, slowly, it started again. Behind the line, Trooper Sevick had stopped breathing too. He had not meant to. He was a soldier. His breath was supposed to be his own. But he had been watching the human since the surgical lamps, watching the way the soft creature dropped its shoulders and slowed its lungs, while the whole corridor climbed the walls, and now he watched that same creature sit down inside death and keep doing it, keep breathing slow, on purpose, while a limb that could have him hung over its head. Sevick found that his own chest had gone tight and shallow and high, everything his instructors had drilled out of him, and he understood with a cold lurch that the human was doing something none of them had been trained to do, not braver, regulated. The human was managing a machine none of them had known they owned. Out on the rock, Marsh worked. He worked the way he'd been taught to work under threat, the priorities in their old fixed order, the worst thing first. The worst thing was the flank, the long opened wound still weeping, and he could not pack it without touching, and he was not ready to touch. So he stayed with his hands in his lap and his voice going, and he waited, and he let the animal spend its terror on a thing that would not spend terror back. Minutes went by. The great head stayed low, level with him, the coal eye fixed on him with an attention that was no longer only rage. Somewhere in it now was a question. "Yeah," Marsh murmured. "Yeah, there it is. You're figuring it out. I'm not one of the things that hurt you." He shifted his weight, slow, telegraphed, and brought one hand up, palm open, not toward the wound, not toward the eye, just up into the air where it could be seen and considered. He held it there. The beast's breath moved across it. The forelimb, still raised, still trembling, lowered by a hand's width. Then another. Marsh let out a long, slow breath of his own and let the animal hear it, and he began, gently, to narrate what he was going to do before he did any of it, the way he narrated for frightened patients who could not understand a word, moving his open hand by inches toward the ruined shoulder, closer, closer, close enough now that the heat of it was on his skin. The translator patch on his collar crackled, Kettlevar's voice, flat, carrying across the dead ground. "Corporal," the officer said, "in 90 seconds I will fire through you." Marsh did not turn around. He kept his hand where it was, a few inches off the beast's shoulder, and he kept his breathing where it was, and when he answered his voice did not climb even a little, which was its own kind of message to everyone listening. "Then you'll answer for a dead medic," he said, loud enough to carry, calm enough to insult. "Your call." "I'm busy." He laid his hand on the beast. He felt the shoulder flinch under his palm, the whole vast body gathering, and he did not pull back, did not freeze, just let the hand ride the flinch and stay, warm and still and unafraid seeming, while he crooned the nonsense low. "There you are! There you are! Easy! Easy, big man!" The gather held for a terrible second. Then it let go. The muscle unclenched under his hand, by degrees, the way a fist forgets to be a fist, and Marsh moved his palm in one slow stroke along the plating, and felt the beast allow it. Behind him the countdown murmured on, indifferent as weather. 90 became 60. 60 became 40. At the cannon, the gunner adept's hand hovered over the firing key and did not descend, because the firing solution ran straight through the small seated shape of an ally, and Doctrine, which had an answer for everything, discovered it did not have an answer for this, for a friendly life placed deliberately across the line of a lawful shot by someone who would not be moved. Kettlevar walked to the very edge of the painted line. He would not cross it. Crossing it was not correct. But he stood there with his cold runes pulsing, and he watched the impossible arithmetic resolve against him, and for the first time in a career built on flatness, he felt something move under the flat. The countdown reached 10, and the young trooper heard himself say the word that would end his career, "Wait." The word hung in the corridor, and nothing fired. Whether it was Sevik's voice, or the gunner adept's hand refusing the key, or Kettlevar's own unmoving silence that let the count run out unanswered, no record ever fixed. The synthetic voice reached its number, found no command behind it, and simply stopped, and the cannon's rising hum sank back down into nothing, and the corridor was left with only the beast's breath and the small human sound of a man murmuring to a monster. Then came the part that none of them had a word for, in any language. It was stillness, just stillness. The human did not press his advantage, did not work faster, did not do anything at all except stay, palm flat on the ruined shoulder, shoulders low, breathing his slow, deliberate breath, saying his going nowhere words. He had stopped even the assessment. He had understood, somehow, that the wound was not the thing that most needed tending, and he had put the tools down and given the animal the only medicine the corridor had refused it, a presence that did not want anything from it, that was not going to hurt it, that was simply and stubbornly there. The seconds stretched, 10, 15. To the watching soldiers, trained to read hesitation as weakness, it looked at first like exactly that, like a man who had run out of nerve, frozen against a thing too big for him, doing nothing because there was nothing left to do. Some of them, deep in the doctrine, felt a flicker of the old contempt. See, the primitive has stalled, the sentiment has bought him nothing. They were reading it as failure right up until the moment it stopped being possible to, because out on the rock, the beast's breathing was changing. Marsh felt it before anyone saw it. Under his palm, the great heaving saw of the animal's breath was lengthening, the ragged in and out pulling slowly wider, the gaps growing, the rhythm of it drifting, without any command, without any drug, toward the slow four-count rhythm of the small warm creature pressed against its shoulder. It was not magic. Marsh knew exactly what it was. He had felt it 100 times with 100 frightened patients whose bodies borrowed the calm of the nearest calm body they could find. An exhausted thing, given permission to stop bracing, will stop bracing. That is all it was. That was everything it was. The trembling in the shoulder eased. The raised weight of terror the animal had been holding through its whole ruined frame began, muscle by muscle, to set down. For the first time since the battle ended, the war beast let its head sink toward the ground, toward the human. The great head came down slowly, and the whole corridor watched it come. It was the size of a small vehicle, that head, plated and scarred and matted black with its own blood, and it descended on the failing neck by inches until it settled onto the scorched rock beside Marsh. And then, with a last small shift that no one who saw it ever forgot, it moved the final hand's width so that the heavy jaw came to rest against the man's crossed leg. The coal eye, still open, was level with his now, close enough to kiss. It watched him with the exhausted, unguarded attention of a thing that has decided, against everything it was built to be, to stop being afraid. Marsh let it. He kept one hand on the shoulder and brought the other, slow as sunrise, to rest lightly on the broad plate of the skull, and he kept breathing his four-count, and the beast breathed it with him. The half-melted collar sat between them, warped and useless where it lay against the animal's throat, the leash and the switch, and the whole logic of remote control slagged into scrap. It had been built to end this creature from a safe distance so that no one would ever have to be where Marsh was now. Marsh looked at it and saw, with a medic's flat practicality, not a symbol but a tool, a heavy, rigid ring, exactly the right shape to keep a wounded head still and supported while a man worked. He reached down and got both hands under the melted band, and he used the thing that had been meant to kill the beast to gently cradle its skull instead, easing the weight of it off the raw neck, taking the strain so the animal could simply rest. "There," he murmured. "There. I've got you. I've got your head. You can put it down now." And only then, with the beast finally still and breathing slow and its skull supported in the ruin of its own leash, did Marsh go back to the wound, packing the flank at last with steady hands, unhurried, narrating every touch, while the great body led him. He was not saving it. He had known from the first assessment that he almost certainly could not. The damage was past what any kit in that corridor could turn back. He was doing the other thing, the older thing, the thing his whole culture still knew how to do, and the aliens had trained itself to forget. He was making sure the dying did not happen alone, and did not happen in terror, and did not happen as a problem to be closed out at maximum safe range. Around him, the corridor had transformed. The soldiers who had stood frozen in contempt now stood frozen in something with no doctrinal name. The young handler who had cried out was weeping openly now, plated face tipped down, and no one beside him looked away. The aversion that had ruled them an hour ago had simply stopped working, burned off in the light of the thing on the rock. The gunner adept had come out from behind the cannon and stood staring with his firing hand hanging empty at his side. And Sevik, who had said wait, had both hands pressed over the lower half of his face, and above them his eyes shone wet in the red light, fixed on the small human and the vast surrendered head resting in his lap, as though he were watching something holy and could not make it stop. The beast's coal eye, level with the man's, dimmed by a shade. Its breath went long and longer, and Marsh moved his hand from the shoulder to the great cheek and held it there, murmuring, "Present," right up until the breathing wound down like a clock and, without struggle, without terror, gentled all the way to still. When Marsh finally looked up, he found the entire corridor staring, not at the beast, but at him. Kettlevar crossed the painted line. He did it slowly. The first time in his career he had entered a neutralization radius on his own feet, and the runes on his chest had gone dark. He had shut them off without deciding to, the way Marsh's breath slowed without deciding to, some deep thing overriding the doctrine at the surface. He stopped a few paces from the man and the dead beast, and for a long moment the flat officer had no words in any of his careful registers. When he found them, they came out wrong-footed, almost human. "It should not have let you live," he said. "None of them let anyone near. That is what they are." Marsh was still sitting. His hands were still red. He looked up at the tall, dark figure with no triumph in his face at all, only the bone-deep tiredness of a man who has done this too many times to feel anything clever about it. "He wasn't trying to kill you," Marsh said. His voice was quiet, and it carried in the silence to every soldier on the line. Not at the end. Probably not even at the start. He looked down at the vast, still head in his lap and back up. "He's not trying to kill you anymore. He's just tired. Most things get mean when they're tired and hurting." The words went into the translator patch and came out in the alien's language. And this time Kettlevar did not fall through them. This time they caught. He looked at the melted collar cradling the dead skull, the switch-turned shelter, and he looked at the young handler weeping unhidden, and the whole corridor of his soldiers standing in the wreckage of a rule they had trusted their whole lives, and he understood, all at once, the way you understand a missing tooth is missing, the size of the thing his people had cut out of themselves and called it strength. He had spent his life unafraid of the asset on the rock. He had commanded its manufacture, its deployment, its scheduled deletion, and never once felt his pulse change. But this, the small, soft creature who had walked into a lawful firing line and sat down and turned a monster's death into a mercy with nothing but his own steady breath, this he did not have a category for, and the thing you cannot categorize is the thing you fear. And the sub-commander, who had never in his life been afraid of a weapon, realized he was afraid of the man who had put one down. The medical drones came at last. They drifted out over the painted line now that the line meant nothing, and behind them came stretcher teams for the beast, though there was no longer any hurry in them, only a strange new carefulness in how they lifted it, as if the manner of a thing's handling had suddenly been discovered to matter. Marsh did not move to help. He stayed where he was on the cold rock with the great head still resting against his leg. Unwilling, it seemed, to be the one who set it down. The corridor gave him room. Even Kettle Var gave him room. Sevik came, eventually. The young trooper crossing the dead ground on unsteady legs to crouch a little distance off, not with any question ready, just needing to be near the thing that had happened. Marsh glanced at him and gave him the smallest tired nod, the one soldiers give each other across every border language ever drew, and the trooper's shoulders came down from around his ears for the first time in hours, borrowing the calm the way the beast had, the way the wounded soldier had, the way calm always travels from the one body brave enough to hold it. Marsh reached into his kit and took out the small worn notebook he still carried, the one that had no business surviving in a modern field pack, and he balanced it on his knee. The aliens watched him do it, this strange primitive rite. He was not writing a report. There was no line in any manual for what a report would say. He turned to a fresh page, and he sat for a moment with the pen still, looking down into the dimmed coal eye of the thing that had led him near. It had never had a name. Assets did not get names. He thought that was, in the end, the whole of what had been wrong here, that a thing could be grown and armored and sent to die and never once be called anything but a number and a function. He wrote a single word in the notebook, closed it, and let the great head rest a little heavier against his knee. I've been keeping this archive a long time, and I have learned to mistrust the tidy lesson. So I'll only ask you what the corridor asked itself that night, and let you carry your own answer out of here. When something has stopped being useful, a weapon, a beast, a person worn down past what they were built to give, is the merciful thing to end it cleanly from a safe distance, or to walk in close and sit down beside it. There is no wrong answer here that I will judge, but I would like very much to read yours below. If this case file moved you, subscribe and stay with the archive. There are far stranger files than this one, and I intend to read you every last one. The archive never forgets, neither should you.